You know, for many of us, some of the longest, truest relationships of our lives have four legs, feathers, fins, or shells. Our pets walk with us through retirement, widowhood, illness, quiet mornings, and long afternoons. They sit beside us when the house feels too quiet. They greet us when no one else is there. And when they're gone, the grief can be profound. Yet, rarely spoken about. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Seniors today. Today's guest gives voice to that love and to that loss. E.B. Bartels is an award winning nonfiction writer, former bookseller, and instructor at GrubStreet with an MFA from Columbia University. Her work has appeared in publications like Catapult and The Millions, and her book, Good Grief, on loving pets here and hereafter has received national attention, from features in major media outlets to being named a best-selling book of the year at Newtonville Books. In Good Grief, E.B. does something remarkable. She travels through history from ancient pet mummification rituals to modern memorial practices, exploring how cultures from around the world honor their animals. She interviews veterinarians, archaeologists, ministers, and grief counselors. She examines famous animals like Rin Tin Tin and Secretariat to show how publicly we celebrate animal devotion, while privately many of us struggle to validate even our own grief. And perhaps most importantly, she challenges the idea that there is a right way to mourn. Her message is simple, powerful, and deeply healing. Caring for our pets in death as we did in life helps us heal, and love never truly disappears. This conversation today with EB is for anyone who has loved deeply, lost quietly, and wondered in their grief, and wondered if it was valid. And it absolutely is. And today we're going to walk through this together with EB. EB, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Jim. I'm happy to talk to you.
And I'm so happy EB is here. This is actually our second conversation. Our first was actually erased in a computer glitch that I had that the people at Apple said they'd never seen before. So EB has been kind enough to give me a second opportunity to speak with her today and to bring this to you, the viewers, and those who are listening. EB, I want to start by reading a review of your book. And the review is from Cy Montgomery, who is a New York Times best-selling author. And he read his book, and here's what he said. Good Grief is just what the doctor ordered. A wonderful, unusual, and healing book full of wisdom and compassion. Nothing can erase the searing sorrow of losing an animal you love, but this insightful, inspiring, intelligent book will offer real comfort. E.B. Bartels' extensive and fascinating research reveals deep and transformative truths about the essential process of grieving. Read this book to affirm that love never dies and you are never alone. EB, I can't think of a better way to start this show and uh, to really let the listeners know how important I think your book is. Tell us a little bit about you and your pet journey. I think in the background I have your book cover. I think I even have one of your pets that shows primarily in there. Um, Tell us about your life and your journey.
Sure. I grew up with a lot of pets. I just always really liked animals when I was a kid. And growing up, I have three older half siblings who are about 10 to 15 years older than me. And so, from a young age, they were already out of the house doing their own thing, busy being teenagers or college students. And so I really had my pets as my, siblings in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like I came out of the womb begging my mom for a dog, basically. She'll confirm that. So I grew up though with not just dogs. I also had I had a tortoise named Aristotle. I had a lot of actually aquatic turtles too that didn't last as long because they were often rescued from the middle of the road and they live in a kiddie pool for like a couple weeks over the summer and then we'd let them go. We had parakeets and finches and tons of fish as well. The only pet I never personally had was a cat because my mom is super allergic to cats and now my husband is actually really allergic to cats. So I may just be destined to never have a
Yeah,
cat, but
yeah, yeah,
I really wanted to show in my book when I was writing about, all these different relationships I've had with animals that people could connect with pets of all different species. It would be very easy to write a book like this just about dogs or just about cats or even just about horses. Like I think mammals in particular are very easy for humans to relate to. But I talked to people who had really close relationships with parrots and iguanas and rats and all kinds of animals that maybe were unexpected, but just as much loved and a big part of their lives.
yeah. So you've had quite a journey with pets. And being in the real estate business years ago, I did some research on support animals. And part of the research was done because I was working with people that were renting out their homes, and people with animals have certain rights. And I think things have changed. But in my research, I saw that some support animals that people were even taking on planes
Hmm.
included one guy who had a pet alligator that he took on the plane. I'll never forget that video that I watched. And so there's no doubt that many of us, most of us, love and the support that we have from the pets that we have. In the research for your book, you talk to veterinarians, you talk to ministers, taxidermists, archaeologists, all while researching your book. And what surprised you most about how seriously professionals across fields take pet loss? What surprised you the most of how they looked at it?
Well, a couple different things. I mean, first of all, when I would tell people I was researching and writing about people grieving their pets, a lot of people assumed this is a new trend. Like, of course, like more people, are having pets instead of having kids, or pets now live in our homes where, a lot of people, when they were growing up, maybe dogs only lived outside or had a cat that like lived in a barn, that kind of thing. But talking to all these different professionals, especially these historians, and the one in particular, I spoke with this incredible professor who she's at the University of Cairo. She's the one who's a expert in animal mummies.
Mm-hmm.
Was just hearing how really people have been mourning pets deeply and intensely since as long as they've had pets. And it was so surprising, I guess, but also really affirming to read about, these communities of indigenous, villages up above the Arctic Circle who have these beautiful, elaborate burials for their dogs because without their dogs, they needed them for, moving sleds through the snow and for hunting. Like they would quite literally not be able to survive without their
Yeah,
dogs. So of
yeah,
course they would bury them with honor and care and love in the same way they would a human. And then, in ancient Egypt too, people loved their pets and they chose to honor them and wrap them and mummify them in the same ways they did for their human family members as well. And so I really loved learning about all those ways that throughout history, people really have always been looking for ways to memorialize and mourn and remember their pets, regardless of how old they were, where they live in the world, what time in history, what country. I just feel like the love for pets is really a universal feeling.
yeah. And it's not a recent American thing. It's a worldwide thing. And you write, about having a pet means that inevitably you're going to be facing loss of your pet. Why do you think that society still struggles to openly acknowledge pet grief, especially for older adults.
Yeah, I think many different people I spoke to for my book talked about how, especially American culture, is very death phobic. People don't like to talk about um, death. People, put off making wills, put off,
Sure.
finalizing their estates and stuff, because it's scary to think about you know, the end. And with pets too, like I would tell people what I was writing about, and so many people would say to me, like, oh, haha, I will never need your book because my cat's gonna live forever. And I would think, oh, maybe you really need my book because like you're not letting yourself anticipate and understand that this is inevitable. Um, and I think though that like people, when it comes to talking about death, people don't want to talk about it for themselves or their human loved ones. But then pets in particular, it's a whole other level of often this really pure, really special relationship that is different than what you have with other people. I write in my book a lot about the fact that, when a human family member, loved one dies, you can have really complicated feelings about that. Like you can be relieved, right? If they were in a lot of pain and they were sick, or you were their primary caregiver and you're exhausted, right? Like you can feel grateful that somebody has died. Or if somebody was abusive and mean and hard, hard to be around, that can also be another feeling. But with pets, it's usually just such a pure, love that it feels, I think, even more excruciating to then think about the possibility of losing that.
Yeah.
And then there's also the fact that there's still this weird hierarchy of species in, I would say, all human society, especially in American society, though, right? To think about humans are superior to like primates, other primates, which are superior to dogs. Like people have this idea based on brain size, or
Hmm.
if they can use tools, or if they show personalities and emotions and that kind of thing. Um, so in that way, I think that people then often sort of often belittle their own feelings and think like, oh, well, I shouldn't be this upset because, at the end of the day, it was just a dog, a cat, it wasn't my grandmother, it wasn't a human. But I think that that really is not being fair to the relationships that people can have with animals that are not Homo sapiens. And, I think that not speaking about that is just simply because people think, oh, it must not be worthy of it. But the more that people speak about this and talk about it and say really openly, when I lost my dog, I was so devastated I had to miss work for several weeks. People then feel, oh, maybe it is okay for me to talk about it. But it's hard to go first, and it's hard to put your feelings out there if you don't know how people are going to react.
Well, your book certainly opens the door to acceptance, and making it normal. The grief is normal, and many seniors that I know have had multiple pets across their lifetime. Did you find that grief compounds over time? Does it get worse, or does it change shape as we age? How does grief, even for a pet like I had when I was a kid, how does it compound over time? How does it change?
Yeah. So, when I was younger, and even when I started first writing this book, I think I assumed, oh, well, you must get used to grieving and it must get easier. And then I spoke to some therapists and I read a lot of book by psychologists and things about death and how people deal with death in general, not just pet death. And the idea is that actually, every loss you experience reminds you of every other loss you've experienced in your life. So, if today you're mourning the loss of your dog, it's also then reminding you maybe of when your grandfather died, or before that, when your childhood parakeet died, and before that, when your grandmother died. It's reminding you of all these different things. And so I actually feel like as people age, in some ways, grief becomes even more um heavy, profound, overwhelming, honestly, because like you just experience more losses as you experience more life, because that's part of it. And my grandfather is 92 and he's now lost, my grandmother, his wife of over 60 years, my aunt, one of his daughters, and he also has lost pets and, his parents, and all these losses, add up and they're really hard for him often to talk about. I think what does change is that as you get older, and experience more losses, you maybe understand better how to take care of yourself while you're grieving. So I think that even if the losses are hitting harder and reminding you of all these other past instances of grief and loss, you perhaps know yourself better and know, okay, I need to take some time off from work, or I need to cancel some social engagements, or I need to go out of my way to reach out to people to, not fall into a depression, or I need to read books or listen to music or go for walks, or, whatever it is. I think as you get to know yourself better as a person, you can figure out better what helps you when you're grieving. But I write about this in the book. I always think about this moment when we had to euthanize my childhood dog, Gus. And it was my first experience putting down a dog, and I was just a wreck. And I was standing outside the vet with my dad, and he was sobbing. And my dad at that point had already had three or four other dogs. And I said, you've done this before. Like, shouldn't it get easier? And he said, every time it's awful in its own way. And it's so true. Like, every grief and death is hard and different in its own way. So, I don't think it gets easier, but I also think that grief, is the opposite of love. And if you've grieved a lot in your life, it means you've loved a lot in your life too. So I think that in some ways it can be a lucky thing to get to grieve.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. In your book, you explore rituals from ancient Egypt to modern Japan. Was there one tradition uh, that struck you as particularly healing or meaningful or even a bit strange?
Well, one, I guess, one that jumped out that definitely people think is strange when I talk about is I interviewed a couple people who opted to have their pets taxidermied or who work as taxidermists. And I tried really hard when I went into the interviews for my book to be really open-minded about, all kinds of grieving practices. And I found I was really, really moved when I talked to people about taxidermy because, to me at first I thought, okay, these are people who can't accept that their pet is dead. They're trying to reanimate them in some way and keep their body around, But when I talk to people, honestly, if someone is seeking out taxidermy for their animal and they want to look at, the deceased form of their pet every day, they are more in touch with death than I think some people are who just opt to get their pet cremated and put in a box and like never look at it or think about it again.
Hmm.
And so I was honestly really impressed by the people this closely. And I began to see it as this really honestly beautiful thing to do to sort of honor the house where your pet spirit lives. And, this one woman I spoke to who I write about in the book, she had her Boston Terrier taxidermied, and she's like, I know he's not alive, and,
Hmm.
I miss his spirit, but I like having his shell basically there, to remind her. And in a way, it's sort of like a sculpture or like a 3D, very detailed photograph. And I was really impressed by, every morning she comes downstairs and he's there in like a glass case in her living room. And there's something, taxidermy can dry out, so you have to
Mm.
oil taxidermy forms to make sure that they don't, disintegrate and fall apart. And often you can just do that by petting them with your hands because, human skin is greasy. And she was saying, like, she'll take him out and she'll pet him to make sure he's like oiled and all that. And she'll talk to him and sort of, remember, special times they had together. And I really was blown away by that kind of ritual. And obviously, that is not for everybody. I spoke to people who do all kinds of things that sometimes when I would talk to other people in the book and mention other, forms of grieving, people would say, "Oh God, like I could never do that," you know?
Yeah,
But I thought that was really neat and in an unusual way to honor animals. And it was cool to think about as an art form. And honestly,
sure.
it made me think I have two pet tortoises right now, and even though there's a good chance they'll outlive me, I started to think about like, oh, maybe preserving one of their shells one day could be a cool way to honor them.
Yeah, well, people that hunt, they bring back, the game. Many will have them taxidermied. They'll have them on their walls. What's what's so different about that? They're celebrating, that, and what's the difference between that hanging on the wall and having your pet taxidermied and have it in the house. I guess it seems strange, but when you really think about it, gosh, maybe not. I think you point out in your book that there's no right way. There's no right way to grieve for a pet, and for someone who's listening, or has a friend or a relative who maybe feels embarrassed, or isolated, even isolated by their grief, what would you want them to hear right now? How can your book help them, perhaps?
Well, I would want people to remember that even though it can feel very isolating and you can feel like you're the only person who maybe has felt this way about your pet, or you are worried that you're a weirdo for being so sad because your pet has died, I would want people to remember that they are not alone. And I wrote this book thinking about, what would I have wanted to hear when I was, a younger person and I was grieving pets and I was embarrassed because I was still so sad about my dog dying, like 2 years after his death. And what would I want to hear? And so in this book, I tried to highlight all these different people and all these different communities that really deeply grieve the loss of animals. And I want people to be able to read my book and look at it almost as like an encyclopedia of all these different options. And you can look and see, okay, maybe this is something that would help me, or maybe this is something that I could try, the next time I lose an animal. So I want people to know that there are groups and people and tools available. And I also would want people to know that there are probably other people closer to them that they might not even realize have experienced the loss of a pet and been profoundly impacted by it. Um, I often found, when I would mention what I was writing about in my book, people just, it was like turning on a faucet. People
Mm,
suddenly would share these stories, and often they would say, I've never talked to anyone about this before. I never really knew who I could share this with.
yeah,
So I think, a really nice way that I often recommend is if you're, on social media, if you're online, if you write a newsletter, post on, Facebook or Instagram or whatever, is if you post like a memorial tribute post. Like my friend Heather, her dog Nelson just died, and she did a really beautiful, Instagram collection of photos. You're throwing that out there, and people who don't get it can just scroll by it and ignore it. But the people who maybe also knew your pet, or at least knew how much you loved your pet and what a big part of, your life that animal was, they can comment, they can engage, they
yeah,
can, reach out and do all the things that you would do if you found out somebody lost a human loved one, right? And that's always what I recommend. People often ask me, what can I do to help someone who's grieving a pet? And I say, think about what you would do if you found out that person's, dad died.
yeah,
Write them a sympathy note. Drop off some groceries, drop off like a lasagna they can heat up later. Offer to go for a walk with them, offer to, just even come over and sit with them, or, if they need help going through stuff, right? Like sometimes it can be really overwhelming to sort through your pet's toys and bedding and you figure out where to donate that stuff if you don't want it anymore. So, offering those things. And also, I find offering specific things because, just saying, like, I'm here if you need anything,
sure,
people often don't know what they need.
yeah,
So, offering very concretely, like, would you like me to go pick up some sandwiches and I can bring them over and we could sit together and eat them? Or I could just drop off a bag of groceries and leave if you don't want to talk to anyone. I think giving a grieving person those options is really nice.
Yeah, I was just reading a couple days ago about how to, what do you say when you're meeting somebody who just lost, someone that they loved, another human, what do you say? We all have that uncomfortable thing if we go to a memorial service or whatever and we're standing in line and then we greet the person whose spouse just passed away. What do you say? Do you say, I'm so sorry, or what? You know, I'm always wondering, well, what could I write? What could I say? And what this article said is, one of the things that you can say is, um, I'd love to learn more about blank. Tell me more about blank. And I'm just wondering if that's something that may be a good way you know, uh, to help somebody when you first meet them and you don't know what to say. You can say, I'm sorry, tell me more about Seymour, your pet, or
Yeah.
whatever your.
No, I really love that because yeah, just saying I'm sorry for your loss can feel kind of empty,
Yeah.
and I do think it often helps to offer, a story from your own experience, but that could be tricky because you don't want to then make it all about you, right? You don't want to
Hmm.
say then like, oh, well, my dog died and I was a mess and blah 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 blah. Like you don't want the person to think that you're trying to walk over them or make it, not about their situation. But yeah, I think all that often people want when they're grieving is to have space to get to think about and talk about their pet. And it's really nice when you're grieving with someone else. So our
Yeah.
dog Seymour, we had to put him down just over 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And my husband Richie and I still miss him so, so much, but it's really nice that we have each other, right? Because we can kind of, something will happen that will remind us both of Seymour, and like we won't even have to say anything. We'll kind of just exchange a look. Like there was this one dog in the neighborhood that Seymour absolutely hated, and so we'll be out for a walk and he'll walk by and we'll kind of look at each other like, oh, there goes Lupo,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's nice to have that, but I think that especially reaching out to people who might be mourning alone. And you spoke earlier about seniors, having these really close relationships with their pets because often they live by themselves. Their kids are maybe grown up and far away. They might be widowed or divorced. So they really could be alone in their home except for their cat or their dog or their parrot or whatever animal it is. And when that animal dies, it's really, really difficult
Yeah.
because just the person or the being that you saw more than any other person is gone. And it changes your whole routine too.
Hmm.
I remember talking to a friend of mine who worked from home, and he said that when his dog died, all of a sudden he realized like 3 days had gone by and he hadn't left the house because his dog was his reason for like, okay, time to get off my computer and go outside and go for a walk. And he said just like without the dog sort of prompting him with those like, okay, it's time to eat lunch, it's time to go outside, it completely, changed everything for
Yeah.
him. So
Yeah.
I think really looking out for people who live by themselves and lose a pet, I think that that can be especially challenging.
Yeah, and I've seen it. I live in a senior community. I'm surrounded by other seniors, and we've lived here for 5 years and have seen the loss that several of our neighbors have had. And again, not knowing what to say and so forth. But what we've noticed, even my wife and I were talking about recently, is how their lives have changed. And it's completely different than it was than when we moved here. And I think that happens for all of us that have pets. The routine changes, something changes. Just feeding them, getting them water, going for a walk, as you
Yeah.
mentioned. Your book is full of heartfelt stories about your own pets. You talked openly about your own pets. Was writing about your personal losses more difficult, or was it more healing? when you were writing your book? Was it a way for you to express your feelings on paper? Tell us about, is it more than you expected? Is it what you expected when you were writing it?
I mean, yes to all of that, I guess. Like
Yeah,
it was really, really hard at times. And the way the book is organized is each chapter is on a different type of animal that I had, right? So there's a chapter about sort of turtles and tortoises and one about dogs um and the chapter about dogs, I like really put off writing that one because my dogs Gus and Gwen. Gus lived until he was 9. Gwen lived until she was 14. And we got Gwen when Gus was 3. So it was like 17 years of my life that I had these two dogs. And it was really hard to write about it. And
yeah,
even then, I found I was kind of holding those stories at arm's length. I remember my editor, who's incredible. I had a couple editors for this book. Naomi Gibbs was the first editor who helped me with the first draft. And she said, Evie, like, obviously these pet deaths had a profound impact on you. Otherwise, like, why would you be writing this book? But like, I'm really not feeling like the emotion behind it. And I clearly was
mm,
like not afraid to kind of dig in and really touch those raw, difficult feelings. And also they were the ones that had happened more recently compared to, the childhood birds and stuff. I had much more distance from those than from
yeah.
the dog deaths. So it was really hard to write about all that. But at the same time, afterwards, it felt really good to have had that out there, and it felt like a really special way to honor their memories and kind of always preserve them on paper. Like, I love knowing that like my dogs are, in the Library of Congress now,
Sure, yeah, yeah, yeah,
so I found it was both things. And then also having those stories out there, I've had so many people talk to me about how much it meant to them that I shared those stories, in the book and that they were able to read them and make them think about their own pets. And so that's been an honor to have people read and relate to my experiences as well.
I get that it's an honor, no doubt, but is it overwhelming as well, EB? I mean, uh, this book has, I'm sure, changed your life in many ways. Where, you know, has your book taken you to a place that you wanted to be, that you hope to be, or is it too much? What's it like having, a best-selling book like you have, and so many people that, when they see you, they know your identity now is wrapped around a good part of it around this book. Is it overwhelming?
Um, I think that the part that can be overwhelming is I love when people share their own pet loss stories with me, but it can often also be a lot to hold all those feelings for people. And like I'm not a licensed grief counselor or a therapist or a social worker. I am just a person who's also loved animals and lost animals. And so, when people come up to me in like the signing line at a book event or after I'm on a panel at a book festival or something and they want to tell me their own pet loss stories, I need to find ways after having these intense conversations to then take care of myself and kind of, not let all these things weigh me down constantly because it's hard. And I think especially when people are sharing things that they feel they've never shared with anyone else before, it's a privilege to get to be that person for somebody, but it also can be a lot as well.
Yeah, yeah. I would
Yeah.
I would think that'd be hard. And again, knowing what to say to them as they're going through your line,
Yeah.
knowing the right words. I'm guessing there were a few tears on your manuscript as you were writing your book, huh?
Yeah, there were, especially in the last chapter when I was writing about Gus and Gwen,
Yeah.
my dogs.
Yeah, a fun part of the book or interesting part of the book, I think it was very near the very beginning where you discuss Rin Tin Tin and you talk about Secretariat and as animals that not just their owners mourn, but the entire world mourned. why does public grief feel more acceptable, do you think, than private grief for someone's own pet, if it does?
No, that's a great question because I think that, well, I don't know. I think that maybe because the animal is already, a celebrity, a well-known entity, and people are often really unabashed about sharing their love for this racehorse or this famous dog actor or, whoever it is, that then when that animal dies, it feels a little bit like this pet that belonged to all of us, and so I think that it's easier to grieve because, you see more people doing it right away because other people have also publicly loved this animal, so therefore they'll publicly grieve. And I think too, when it's your own pet, dogs, you walk out of the house, and like I got to know a lot of our neighbors from walking Seymour, and um other pets, though, like indoor cats or, reptiles that live in a terrariums inside, they're often really limited to just you, as the one who interacts with them. And so when you're grieving that pet, it can kind of be like, well, why should anyone care? I was the only person who knew and loved this animal, so like, what does it matter? But I think something that is actually pretty special. I'm often very down on social media and a lot of
Hmm.
technology stuff,
Hmm. Hmm.
but through social media, people post about their pets. And even if they're not like an Instagram celebrity animal, you get to know people's pets that maybe previously, pre-Instagram, pre-Facebook, whatever, people would have only, had at home, and you would only know if you went to their house, right? But, I feel like I've gotten to know like my friends, cats who I've never met, because they're always posting about them online. And so I think in that way too, grieving publicly your personal pets can now feel a little safer, maybe because you've seen people react positively when you're putting it out there, when they're doing something funny, or, you're showing how much you love them online, that I think it feels less scary to then put out how much you're missing them too, now, because more people are sort of involved in your relationship, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah, it makes total sense. And of course, with Secretariat and with Rin Tin Tin and even Mr. Ed, I mean,
Yeah.
we've all grown up with those pets, those animals that were made really had an effect in our life. Um, EB, so what's next for you? You're doing a lot of different things, and I think your book has been so widely accepted. What's next for you, and what do you want to do next?
Yeah, well, I haven't been writing as much lately because I have a 2.5-year-old son, human son.
Yeah.
And Luca is great, but being the mom of a toddler is all-consuming and very tiring. But it's also made me think a lot more too about how parents teach their kids about pet death, and ways I can help Luca, as we have animals who are part of his life and then move on. And I often had lots of parents come up to me at book events who would say along the lines of, we had a baby and we got a puppy at the same time, and now our daughter's 13 and our dog is 13, and the dog is really sick and not doing great, and our daughter's freaking out because she literally cannot imagine life without
Sure.
this
Yeah.
this animal.
Yeah.
And so I've been thinking a lot about that, and my goal is to write, not exactly like a young adult version of Good Grief, but a similar-ish kind of book about grieving pets, but aimed for a younger audience, maybe, 8 to 12-year-old, sort of middle grade. And also thinking about ways that kids can really take ownership over their grief and find ways that they can do activities or learn how to write their own obituary, plan a memorial service, things that are really helpful tools for grieving that often I feel like kids get left out of that process. And when you're when you're in elementary school, middle school, it feels like your whole life is out of your hands, right? All these other people
Mhm.
are calling the shots. And so if you lose a pet, it can be really hard because that feels like another thing that's out of your control. But I'm trying to write something that would let kids kind of take ownership over a really hard thing and find ways that, they can plan a funeral for their dog and invite the whole neighborhood if they want. So that's what I'm working on, though right now it's kind of more still in my head than it is on paper.
Sure, and maybe even a children's book, a good grief version, for children,
Yeah.
to help them understand it, because parents sometimes are too busy to actually help their child grieve and think, whatever, let's move on. We're busy.
Yeah.
We have to go out, get a paycheck. We have to put food on the table, and so forth. So if people want to purchase your book, obviously it's available on Amazon, and it's easy to find. And I would strongly suggest that people grab your book and perhaps even think of someone, if you haven't lost a pet, or if you have, read the book, and when you're done with the book, gift it to somebody who you think could use the book and who would benefit. That's something that I did, and I thought I can give great joy to somebody, help them understand the grieving process and so forth. So people can find you just about everywhere. What is your website that people can go to, Eb?
Sure, it's just ebbartels.com. You can go there and you can learn more about me and see links to all the different media coverage that Good Grief has gotten and see clips of my writing portfolio. You can also follow me on Instagram at Good Grief Pets Book on Instagram. That's my Good Grief specific account, and I'll often post tributes to people's pets. Or I now get, you asked Jim about like how my life has changed from this book, and I'll say that now all of my friends text me photos whenever they are somewhere and they happen on a pet cemetery or a park bench in Central Park that has a dedication to a pet. So my Instagram is often a lot of these great things that people text me from all over the world, of different pet tributes.
Yeah.
So you can find me those two places. And I also want to add too that Good Grief, it was just published in paperback in the fall, so it's now available for a more cost-effective,
Mm-hmm.
budget-friendly version.
Sure.
But also, I think it's a great gift, not just when somebody has lost a pet or when somebody's pet is sort of aging and getting ready for that transition. But my friend Greg jokes that he wants to give copies to people as soon as they get a new puppy or kitten because, it's something like you should always be thinking about and know that it's part of life. It's going to happen.
Yeah.
So yeah, really, I like to think it's for anybody who has a pet, and even my friend Melissa, who's never been a big pet person, she read my book and found it very enlightening to understand, why people care as much as they do about their animals. So I
Yeah.
like to think it's a good book for everyone.
I think it is too, and it's not a morbid book. There's a lot of joy. That's very uplifting in many ways, and it's obviously the research you did was very interesting as well. One question that I ask all my guests at the very end is, is there something I should have asked you that my audience should know that I failed to have in my notes? And you know what? I asked you this before because of course we had a podcast before that
You
melted.
did, and
Do you
honestly,
remember?
I can't remember what I said that time, probably because, toddler mom brain.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
I will say, I think the thing is actually what you just touched on already, that this book isn't just a morbid, sad, depressing book. I really tried to show the joy of loving pets because that's why it's so awful when they die, right? Because it's so wonderful when they're part of our lives. And I also just tried to really embrace the humor that I think our pets remind us of. Life is absurd and wacky and fun and weird. And I've loved all my pets so much because I feel like they really remind me of that. And so I try to really embrace that feeling in the book as well.
Yeah. Well, I just love the book. I love the opportunity to talk to you. I love also to be able to tell my audience about your book because I think it's so important for people. You know, I have had one note that I wrote down, and the note that I wrote down was to end with something that I wrote down, and it's that I wanted to thank you for reminding us that grief, it's not a weakness. It's not a weakness at all. It's more the proof of love. And that love, as you show so beautifully in your book, never truly leaves us. And so thank you for bringing that to us and being who you are. I appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim.
And thank you to the Senior to Seniors audience. Please, if you find this podcast worthwhile, please like it, please subscribe it, please even post it on your Facebook or your social media pages. I bet you'll get more comments from this kind of a post talking about pets than you'll get from just about anything else. And just think how you might help change the life of someone that's important to you. E.B., thank you so much, and we'll talk again. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.